Welcome back. Oluwadare Kolawole, the Deputy Director of Socioeconomic Rights and Accountability Project, SERAP, as well as governance advocate and human rights lawyer, joins us on the program as we talk about the economy with focus on the debt profile of states and the nation and the loans they are obtaining, as well as fiscal propriety. That's the conversation we'll be having in the next few moments. Mr. Kolawole, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, Jeffrey.
I know that SERAP has been in court every other day, literally, to, put government in check. I don't know how that has helped in really putting them in check. That's the conversation we're going to have at some point on the show. But the concern here is that our debt burden keeps increasing, and no thanks to the exchange rate. As it stands now, I think the last time we checked, almost 80-something or so trillion naira in domestic debt. When you add the ways and means that has accrued over 7 trillion, plus the 22 that was, or 23 that was originally collected. In terms of external, we're almost hitting 50 billion. And the numbers are not looking good, despite the fact that they are saying we're having accretion with FPI due to the reforms of the central bank and all of that. But as a first take on in this conversation, isn't it disturbing that despite the removal of fuel subsidy and more money into the federation account, which at some point got to 1.7 trillion, that was they disbursed about 900 billion, so that they will not have too much liquidity in the system, governors are still going borrowing?
It's not, thank you very much, Jeffrey. And I could see the way you are conversant with the figures, just like every Nigerian, of how much Nigeria owes. But the question is, do we know how these funds have been spent? And it's not really surprising, really, that governors are borrowing. The federal government, including the president himself, the head of the government, has set that example, which I think it is not good. So there are two issues here. The borrowing, as it were, and then the transparency and accountability mechanisms that support the borrowing, that justifies it, so to speak. So the governors are borrowing, but we do not see a reflection of that, either in capital projects or even in the socio-economic development of the people. And that is why this issue of transparency and accountability comes in. It is not enough to borrow. Nigeria has always made this argument that it is not about it's the debt to GDP ratio is good. But much more importantly, how does that translate to the economics of everyday Nigerians? The governors are borrowing. The federal government is borrowing also. And then we cannot see how those funds are impacting on Nigerians, because we know that funds have been borrowed, but we do not know how those funds are spent. Unfortunately, Nigerians they are the victims, even though ideally Nigerians should be the beneficiaries.
Well, Jeffrey started up also by talking about fiscal propriety, fiscal responsibility. And during the last administration, there were concerns from the Ministry of Finance about how the administration was breaching the Fiscal Responsibility Act with the Ways and Means procurement. Now, looking at the Fiscal Responsibility Act itself, it sets requirements for the National Assembly to approve a set limit for not just the federal government, but the subnationals as well on debt. But it seems as if there is a continuous breach even by the state government, if you consider how much loans have been secured. Now, the question is, why do we have a Fiscal Responsibility Commission if it has no power to bite?
Yeah, thank you very much. The same reason why we have several laws, including judgments of courts, including from SERAP, that the government has simply refused to obey. And what the government does from time to time is the Finance Act is amended more than any law in Nigeria every year to accommodate some of the fiscal policies of government. So the amendment of the Fiscal Finance Act, the Finance Act every year also impacts on the Fiscal Responsibility Act. But much more importantly, even the provisions that are the guardrails in the Fiscal Responsibility Act that are not amended, they are not simply adhered to, and that itself solves the problem. So, for example, there are provisions in the Fiscal Responsibility Act that mandates that any borrowing should be for social development, and there must be a cost-benefit analysis to ensure that this is examined how will favor the people. And that is not done. At least we've not seen the National Assembly do that. Whenever the executive puts their proposals to borrow for the National Assembly, the National Assembly doesn't even bother to have public hearings. And the National Assembly, of course, has the power to do these things, because it's a bill, as it were, to ask questions, to let Nigerians weigh in. And that is why laws like the Fiscal Responsibility Act is observed more in the breach than in observance. But again, that is not surprising. Impunity. has gone on for far too long that it appears to be the norm. And when we find government, either officers or institutions, do the right thing, you can see the Nigerians are always surprised. But again, we shouldn't be surprised that we're here. I think why we should be surprised is why we are not doing more as a people to ensure that we hold government to account.
Yeah, pardon me. Days now into that ultimatum which you gave.
So you're counting?
We are counting because it's a 1-week ultimatum, and I think it's important to follow these things up so that Nigerians are not taken for granted. It is no man's money. It is our money. So the 1-week ultimatum was given to Nigeria's 36 state governors and the Minister of the FCT to account for loan agreements and spending details of some 5.9 trillion naira and $4.6 billion loan obtained by their states and the FCT. Surprise me, please. Have you gotten any feedback? We acknowledge we're working on it. I need some surprise.
I think the surprise will come from the state governors. We are yet to get a response to the freedom of information request. Of course, we have 7 days. 7 days to respond, either to give the information, to provide information requested for, 7 days to either decline, or 7 days to transfer the request to another institution that would have such information. Those are the provisions of the Freedom of Information Act. We are yet to get a response.
4 days in silence.
Yes, unfortunately. But really, I'm optimistic. I'm quite hopeful that we'll get the responses either before we end up in court, which really I'm not eager for us to go to court on this matter.
Are you sure?
I'm not really. They should trust me. These unfortunately shouldn't end up as another public interest lawsuit. But what we found is that whether they provide information, the information before the ultimatum are certifically provided by the Freedom of Information Act, or while we're in court, while the file processes, some of this information that gets released, as it were. So we've seen cases where a public institution would decline to give us information, and during the process of the lawsuits, 1 or 2 of their lawyers will probably provide those information. And really, so I'm hopeful, and I really see no reason why a governor should not be eager. At least this should be an opportunity for them to showcase what they've done. I see them buy slots on TV and on print to show what they've done. So this is an opportunity for the governors and even the FCT minister to show the people what they've done with those funds. I really see no reason why they shouldn't do that, really.
The FCT minister has over 1 trillion to spend in this fiscal year. That's a lot of money. The question I want to follow up on what Kayode said, after the 7 days, we've seen SERAP take them to court, public interest, all of this. What happens if you go to court? You get a judgment eventually in the favor of the public. What happens? Is it I know it's justiciable, but how do you implement that judgment to make sure that they give account to the public?
I think in this case, evidence abounds, so we won't explain tire, as they say on the streets. And I really see no reason why we won't have judgment in favor of Nigerians if we do go to court. But really, I don't think we'll go to court on this matter, at least not to a certain, for most of the
why are you optimistic?
Because like I said, I really see no reason why they would not provide
4 days down the line, nobody has spoken to you. Nobody has even honored anything you said. So there are 36 states and the FCT 37. No one, in terms of percentage, 0.
It's just,
has even said, hey, we heard you.
And we just finished Easter celebrations. Perhaps in the spirit of Jesus, Jesus is rising from the dead. Perhaps we'll see some bounce back from these public officers. But as to what transpires in court and what happens thereafter, it is always interesting to see the arguments put forward. Really, I wish we would have time to look at the analysis of some of the things that these public institutions put forward in their bid to defend the lack of transparency. But sometimes they go legalistic, but amidst all those conversations in the courtroom, you can see a certain unwillingness, a lack of distrust to provide information, and really, which shouldn't be. But in this instance, Nigerians know how much loans these governors have gotten, and if we can see the present governor of Kaduna State mention this in public, perhaps for the present governors who did not take those loans, this would be the best time for them to say, hey, since I've come in, I've not taken a penny, I've not taken a kobo, and this is what I've seen or I've not seen in all those funds. Even though some of them are taking up loans to, like you've seen from the analysis of the Debt Management Office, that in the first 6 months of administration, and this has gone on for too long, this is not recent, in the first 6 months of every new administration, there's always an upsurge in loans, and then the last 6 months also, which I think is quite understandable. You guys come in and they want to do some things, and then when they are exiting, of course, running up towards elections, these things will happen. So these conversations about transparency and accountability, anti-corruption, and good governance, they are all linked. And again, it translates to the economy. Unfortunately, it bounces back on Nigerians as the ultimate victims. But I see no reason why we won't have judgment, and I see no reason why this judgment will not be enforced on behalf of the Nigerian people.
You know, Kadi and Jeffrey's concerns are legitimate because SERAP is seen as a professional suer. And I'd also like to ask how many cases you have in court against government. You know, but for me, that will be on the periphery. I'd like to go back yet again to the concern about fiscal responsibility. And perhaps you can also educate us about what it says about putting a limit on the borrowing appetite of the subnationals and the federal government. This takes us back to a few years down the line when the former governor of Kaduna State was going to borrow, and you know there were oppositions from members, lawmakers who were from his own state. So what is contained in the Fiscal Responsibility Act that prevents, that puts a limit on the subnationals to borrow? And if we have 13 new governors who have borrowed to the tune of over 250 billion naira, that means that there was no scrutiny from the National Assembly.
Among the various provisions of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is aimed at ensuring that agents of government, including the federal government, do not pass certain thresholds, is the GDP ratio per annually as to how much can be borrowed. But when you look at the trajectory over the years, these has always been breached by the federal government itself, by the ways and means. The Buhari administration did that twice. We went to court. The matter is still in court as we speak. And so it is not surprising if the federal government can do this, the states will follow suit. And don't forget, when the states borrow external debts, of course the federal government is guarantees that loan, sort of. So it is not surprising. So the discussion should not be about what the states are doing. It's about the federal these laws. And about it. And don't forget, the National Assembly plays a very important role in amending the Finance Act every year. It is at the stage of amending the Finance Act that the National Assembly, as representatives of the people, should have asked these pertinent questions about either the midterm or the long-term borrowing plans, and to be able to provide that much in the checks and balances, but they don't. So Nigeria's problem is not a lack of laws. We have lots of them. They're very good laws as they are, but it is that when people, public institutions and public officers, get away with breaching these laws, then they simply get away with it. So by amending the Finance Act, it impacts on many laws, including the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and nullifies some of those sections that allows government agencies, state governors in this instance, to do those things. But I think the angle we are looking at of transparency and accountability is that these laws have been breached that have allowed these governors to borrow. What have they done with those funds? Let's start the conversation and perhaps work backwards to how they have breached the laws. And like I told you, we have 2 cases in court presently against the Buhari administration for breaching the provisions of the Fiscal Responsibility Act by use of ways and means, which is yet to be determined.
You know, one of the purposes of this conversation is also to equip people with the right information they can use in engaging governance, right? So you have governance at different levels, and people need to take this up, not just it ended in the studio. So speak to us what the possibilities are. If after the next 3 days you do not get the information you need about the breakdown and all, which is accountability and transparency, what are the possibilities? Because obviously if you don't want to expose something, it means something is happening behind the scenes. So can we then look at those states and say, the money was diverted, was stolen, was misappropriated, or something fishy really happens? So many, and I can go on and on. We have a lot of these things. So is that the possibility? Is that how we should begin to approach, these people in government? Because obviously they didn't open their books for us to see. And I'd also like you to speak to how it is from your experience. We've seen, and I'm talking maybe governors, commissioners, civil servants stealing public funds. What are those ways the ways and means with which they do it. So again, people are aware and they can begin to look out for these things so we can work together and end this.
Kyrie, you're giving me the job of the EFCC to try to give you insight as to how to do these things.
I mean, as little as you can, let's empower people.
So, but this is very important to the first part of your questions about the next step, as it were. These conversations are important, which I think is very important platforms that your organization is providing. Your aim is for the citizens to take this up. SERAP has written FY request this time. It's public knowledge and probably will end up in court. But much more importantly, from the president to the governors to the National Assembly to the state of assemblies, they represent people, they have constituents that should take this up. Like we've seen with pension laws, the outcry has gotten so much that we started to see the change. Yeah, maybe a bit in trickles, but we've seen what happened in Abia State. We've seen what Lagos has said some years ago. We've seen what has happened in Enugu State to pension laws. So the aim is for people to take this conversation, own this fight, so to speak, and to be able to make sure it translates to some level of transparency and accountability. And that is why the question that SERAP is asking is very important. Much more than the issue of breaking the laws to borrow in the first place, like I've said earlier. It is about tracing how these funds have been spent. You've asked about how this stealing takes place. It's about the procurement process. If these funds have been borrowed legitimately or not, then the procurement process is how they spent. Who got the contract? Where are the locations of the contract? What is the process? And who are the beneficiaries and all that? That is how these funds end up being stolen. Construction of a 20-kilometer road at 30 billion naira. Whereas if you look at it, it shouldn't cost 10 million naira. That's how these things end up in private pockets.
So can we, pardon me, say that those who don't give us information have something to hide and we can classify them as suspected thieves?
Yes, really, because really, and the thing is, the law mandates these public institutions to provide this information. Why did the Debt Management Office put forward details of how much Nigeria has borrowed? Each state is written there clearly, the domestic, the external loans. Then why can't we know what these funds have been used for? Really?
So at the end of the day, let's posit it as much as possible. Is SERAP thinking of changing strategy in approaching public accountability? I'll give you a classic example so you can speak to it. Delta State, December 2021, according to the DMO, their debt status was 154 billion. In 1 year, by the next December 2022, under the Okowa government, the debt has grown to 304 billion. And there's a state assembly. Does SERAP look at these assemblies and say, besides these governors, these are the people that also should be held accountable because they are the ones that should bring that check and balance? I'm saying 150 billion was borrowed in 1 year. To do what is the question. Maybe the governor can answer for himself or not. I'm just using that as an example, classic example. DMO has that record. I have it here. So is SERAP thinking of changing strategy to beyond the governors to the state assembly? Because they are the ones that actually naturally are supposed to hold these people accountable.
And yes, we do that, which is why, again, it's not only about against the governor, the president, as it were. It's about all public institutions. Ultimately, the aim is for the people to take this up. We've been having this conversation and millions of people around the world are listening. I believe that after this conversation, they are better informed enough to take up this advocacy. The members of the state assembly in Delta State, of course, they represent people who should be able to ask these pertinent questions. Perhaps they do not know this figure that you have quoted. Now they know. And then they're able to take up this advocacy beyond the three issues that I think has always divided Nigerians: tribe, politics, and religion. So when the people understand the reason, the legal framework, that the governor owes them a duty to tell them, and they also have a right to ask, and then they'll take this up. And bit by bit, we build that critical mass that will end up getting a change. Like I've mentioned, pointing to what has happened with the pension laws, I'm very optimistic that people owning the fight more and more will really bring us good results in the short term and really in the medium term also. You know, and then
Curtis' question about deterrence is also instructive. Look at the Auditor General's report of just February 2024. 256 MDAs violated regulations, spent over 284 billion naira without approval. So where is the EFCC in all of this? Why do these reports become normal for us?
That's the issue, and that's why one of the asks that we put in the latest request to all the governors and the FCT minister is for them to also invite the ICPC and the FCC, and we copied these two agencies in the letter in the FY request also, for them to monitor the spending. If they have nothing to hide, let these agencies do their job. And as part of the petitions and the various advocacy initiatives, we also get invited by the FCC from time to time to speak to these things, which includes our advocacies on the Auditor General's report. Really, and that is why when you read read the Auditor General's report, it creates a big picture of what happens at the MDAs. The Auditor General puts it in black and white that these agencies simply cannot explain. And if you know what an auditor does, it simply looks at what has come in by way of inflows, it looks at the planned proposed expenditure, and it looks at any paper trail that shows that this fund has been spent. And this guy comes up to say, I can't see any paper or document that documents how these funds have been spent. And again, nothing gets done. And that is why we need to continue this conversation, really. We need to be optimistic about this.
And you know, the thing is, for every naira that is unaccounted for, when you aggregate it, that's probably a hospital that is not built, a road that is not constructed, a school.
Maternal mortality on the rise.
You know, the list goes on and on. But I'd like to ask you, this is a bit personal. I was reading tweets about SERAP of late, and this particular one says, I wish SERAP was a more serious body. I like the idea, but no bite and implementation. That's from Maurice Monnier on X. And this is like what you find across board. So do you feel sometimes that you're unfairly treated? Maybe Nigerians put a lot on your shoulder. SERAP, don't just take them to court. You need to enforce this. Don't just enforce this. You need to ensure that these people cough out the monies. In fact, you need to protest on our behalf. Do you feel like people maybe treat you unfairly and expect too much from SERAP?
Perhaps I need therapy. But I think that is why these conversations are also important, to educate the people, for them to know. SERAP is a civil society organization, and we've taken up this as our duty to do these things that we do. Again, the aim is for the people to own it,
so
to understand it.
What can you do and what can you not do?
We can go to court. The same way every citizen can go to court. We can write to government by way of advisories, we can write petitions and complaints, and we can use every kind of legal mechanisms that we have, and we can protect the rights of the people. But it stops there, and we can have conversations like this in furtherance of our freedom of expression. But we cannot take part in politics, as it were. So the aim is for people to understand that SERAP has done its bit. It is for the citizens who are now better informed to take up this advocacy process. And like the person who tweeted this, I think that might be coming from a place of angst, a seeming frustration. I do not think it meant, but I think it meant well. He is probably frustrated, but we have decided that we cannot be pessimistic. We are not cynical.
Can you bite? He wants you to bite.
So how will a civil society organization bite? We are not the EFCC. We are not the ICPC. We can only go to court, and hoping the court will side with us. And many times the court have sided with us, and that is why we continue to do this.
So sometimes you feel that the states, whether it's the federal or the subnationals, are becoming immune to embarrassment, because the whole idea is, well, you're putting them out there to say, account for this, account for that, cough out this, else we'll give you this ultimatum. If you don't do this, we'll take legal action. I've read so many SERAP, like thousands or hundreds of SERAP information and threats of this and that or the other. Like I had to say, it feels frustrating sometimes, but do you also perceive that government has now looked at SERAP and every other civil society organization and say, they will just talk and that's the best they can get?
I don't think so. Again, I'll point to what has happened with the pension law in Abia State. This advocacy works not because SERAP is doing it, but because citizens are taking this up. So why did the Abia State government pass the pension law? I do not think it's political. It is because the people have spoken up for so long, and we are nearing that critical mass that just means that we can't continue like this. So we will continue to do this, really. And I do not think that the government has become immune through this kind of advocacy initiatives. And really, we do get some kind of informal feedbacks. We've had lawyers from government in court meet us on the corridors of the courtroom and say, hey, guys, you're doing a good job, keep it up. That has happened several times. And then we get back to court and they're defending their bosses, their paymasters as well.
We'll keep dragging them.
I have a follow-up to that, but we're totally out of time.
We're totally out of time, because it's quite tiring to see that if you run a business, for instance, you will be a little bit more careful on how you spend your money because you know how hard it works. But I think because sometimes some government officials, this money is free money. That's the truth. You collect taxes, you don't do it. Government really doesn't do anything than to just make sure that they collect taxes and royalties and all of this. So this plenty money. That's why we're saying sometimes maybe they are immune to embarrassment. No. This guy they'll just talk and nothing will happen. Oluwadare Kolawole, Deputy Director of SERAP and Governance Advocate and Human Rights Lawyer. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, guys.
Oh, well, we'll continue to keep government on their toes. That's what the provision of the Constitution in Section 22 allows us to do, to hold them accountable. That's why we have the likes of SERAP to also join in that campaign.